Hello and welcome to the Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy and I love history and travel. You're very welcome to come along with me. Nuremberg sits atop a major trade route, prospered in the Middle Ages, and was a rich cultural and artistic capital of the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. The town, and especially the castle, lost their prominence in the 17th century, but were revived in the 20th when it was the lionized and admired beating heart of the Nazi movement, the site of huge government investments and rallies of the party faithful. The city was badly damaged at the end of World War II. Estimates vary, but I've read as much as 90% of the city was damaged or destroyed. Now rebuilt, the city promotes itself as a world capital of tolerance. Today we're going to visit the Sebald district, which lies north of the Peigitz River and reaches to the former Imperial Castle. The area is very hilly, but fortunately there are alternatives to walking, including Nuremberg's excellent public transportation system, several hop-on, hop-off buses with scheduled routes which will take you to all the major sites, and even a silly but fun little train dressed up as a locomotive hauling visitors around. As armchair travelers, we have plenty of options to walking, and one of them is just to follow along virtually. Let's take a look. If you think this content is interesting or useful, please like, share, and subscribe. This will help the channel grow. Travel content often involves a lot of history, and history can be really word-heavy, heavy enough that the details often don't make it into a video blog. If you care to dig deeper, you can visit my regular blog on WordPress, where you'll find deep dives, travel tips, reviews, warnings, and the nuts and bolts on how to travel safely and conveniently. If you'd like to keep up with my posts, you can follow me on Twitter. The addresses are on your screen and in the description box below. These photos show you the iconic exterior and one of the lovely interior views of Holy Spirit Hospital. Today this is an interesting bridge, one of several interesting crossings over the Peigitz River, but once upon a time, when Nuremberg was a free city back in the 14th century, this was the largest hospital in the area. The building now is a restaurant and a senior citizen home, rather than a museum, which is something of a shame, but you can go inside and have a look at the interior courtyard shown above on the left. One of the reasons to travel, aside from the ability to live someplace else and get away from where you do live, is a chance to learn history on the hoof. I have to admit, my knowledge of German history and culture was virtually nil when I started preparing this blog, despite the fact that my father's entire family hailed from this general area. They arrived in America before the Revolution and discarded their German heritage, especially after 2 world wars. I tripped over an image of this odd fountain while I was looking at Google Maps, and my curiosity bump started to itch. The Narrenschiff, the word means ship of fools, is a bronze monument showing characters from a 15th century satire of the same name. The story is an allegory written by Sebastian Brandt, making fun of all kinds of foolish people. Among other things, the author invented a hilarious saint, Saint Grobian, the patron saint of vulgar and coarse people. This rather modern interpretation in bronze was loosely based on a painting of Hieronymus Bosch, shown on the left. I like city markets and will generally go somewhat out of my way to find one. The Hauptmarkt, or Market Square, is in the heart of the city, close to the river. The area in and around the market is chock full of places to spend money on fresh food and vegetables, and also restaurants. These places are almost always fun to visit, and depending on the season, fresh produce is usually available. There is also quite a bit to explore nearby. The Church of Our Lady sits on the site of a former synagogue. This area, close to the river and the central market, was low-lying and swampy in the Middle Ages. At that time, it was home to the city's Jewish population. The locals forced the Jews out, claiming that they were somehow responsible for an outbreak of the Black Plague in 1349, against which the Catholic Church could offer neither help nor defense. This architectural style is called German brick Gothic, although the front is faced with cut stone. I'm guessing here, but since the castle is built on a sandstone cliff, perhaps the facing was sandstone. It's a relatively soft stone. The Gothic part of this is obvious from the pointed arches above the windows and over the main entrance. The west facade of the Frauenkirche is richly decorated. Doorways on the porch are decorated with sculptures of Adam and Eve, the Virgin and prophets. To the left, the porch is decorated with male saints, while on the right there are female saints. At the corners are sculptures of the royal benefactors who paid for all of this. Much of the interior of this church was damaged or destroyed during World War II, although some of the movable parts, including some of the stained glass, was packed up and stored safely in the arts bunker, which we'll visit a little later today. A surviving interior attraction remained, close to the entrance and called the Devil's Footstep. The story goes that the devil made a deal with the contractors to pitch up a church with no windows. Apparently Satan fears daylight. When the building was completed, it was properly blessed. That meant the devil couldn't come completely inside to check out his handiwork. But the devil could still stand in the entryway, so it came back to check up before it coughed over the money. From where the devil stood, the interior did seem pretty dark, and he couldn't see any windows. The devil was pleased and paid up. But then he saw light and realized that the windows were there, just hidden by some columns. When the devil discovered that he had been tricked, he could only stand in the foyer and stomp his foot furiously, which left a dark footprint that remains visible in the church's entrance today. Probably the most interesting medieval artifact in this church is located just beneath the gorgeous reproduction blue clock on the face of the building. It consists of a seated figure of Charles IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, somewhat hidden, unfortunately, in every photo I've been able to find by the netting designed to keep the pigeons and other birds out of the contraption. Every day at noon, after the church bells ring, there are trombone players, drummers, and whistlers who make a noise. Then the doors open on either side of the emperor, and 7 electors parade in front of him, just as they did when they made him Holy Roman Emperor and have for most of the time for the last 500 years. You can see a detail of them on the right. Time may march on, but the display often did not. It doesn't surprise me to read that the clock and the running men have worked, stopped working, been repaired, rebuilt, failed again, were decommissioned, recommissioned, and finally moved. In 1944, it dawned on the Nurembergers that perhaps international adventure might not end well, so they dismantled the running men, along with a great deal more art in the city, and stored the entire unit, broken down into component pieces, in the arts bunker under the Imperial Castle. On January 2, 1945, the church and the clock were destroyed, although the running men survived. The church was rebuilt, a replacement clock commissioned, and the running men repaired and reinstalled, where they continue to this day to pay homage to the Holy Roman Emperor. The gorgeous and somewhat gaudy fountain you see in front of you sits in the market square just between the Franconian and the market. It was built in the 14th century and is considered one of the most important attractions here in the city. The fountain is 60 feet high, shaped like a Gothic church spire, and its name means beautiful fountain. The fountain was built when the area was repurposed from a Jewish quarter to part of the city center. The fountain did more than just provide water. It provided what we'd call propaganda, telling about the city and the church. There are 40 colorful figures representing icons of the Holy Roman Empire, including the evangelists, the prince-electors, various prophets, and other biblical figures. The design did stray a bit from God and empire in one small detail shown on the right. The legend now is that spinning those 2 brass rings embedded in the fence around the fountain will bring you good luck. This quarter of the city is named after Sebaldus Church. The church reminds us how architecture in the Middle Ages actually wasn't static, although it might have seemed so to the builders. Had construction been faster, the style would have been the same from beginning to end, but mostly these buildings took a very long time to get finished. Construction of the church began in 1225 in Romanesque style, with semicircular interior arches and barrel vaults, thick walls, and sturdy pillars. During the 14th century, it was enlarged by adding side aisles and a Gothic-style chancel, the area between the altar and ending with the round apse. The towers were added in the 15th century, and the entire interior was remodeled in Baroque style. Baroque architecture favors movement over solidity, contrast and color over similarity and plainness. It was a decorating trend and designed, at least for churches, to provide a bright and vivid contrast to the comparatively plain design aesthetic of Protestant architecture. Although the church was badly damaged during World War II, some of the artwork actually survived, including the shrine of St. Sebaldus, which we'll look at next. I grew up in the Protestant tradition in an area that was heavily German in origin, but even so, I had never heard of St. Sebald. I had to look it up. It turns out Sebald was an Anglo-Saxon missionary to Germany in the 9th or 10th century. He may even have been a real person. He settled down as a hermit in the woods just outside the city wall. The story about why he is venerated goes like this. According to the legend, one bitter cold night, Sebald was lost in the forest. By good luck, he stumbled into a clearing where he saw a peasant's cottage. The poor couple who lived there welcomed him and gave him a seat beside the fire. Sebald was chilled to the bone, and the fire was too small to give off much heat. So he asked the man of the house where he kept the firewood so they could get a good blaze going. The peasant said he and his wife had to ration their fuel because they didn't have much left. "Go outside," Sebald told the lady of the house, "and break the icicles off the eaves of the house, as many as you can carry." A few minutes later, the woman returned with a large stack of icicles. Sebald took them from her and arranged them in a fireplace where they caught fire and burned as well as a hardwood log. That's why believers pray to Saint Sebald to help them get through the cold of. This monument to Saint Sebaldus is one of the few interior decorations to survive World War II, and as far as I've been able to figure out, it did so on site. I think it was probably too big to move. It's cast bronze, 14.5 feet tall, 7 feet long, and more than 4 feet wide. The sculptor was named Peter Vischer the Elder. Peter was a Nuremberg boy who spent most of his life living and working here. The monument is his masterpiece. I don't think he was a modest man either. He put an image of himself at one end of the base, presented as a stout, bearded man. You can see an enlargement showing him in the photo on the right. These two views look up from the riverside and down from inside the castle. The Imperial Castle is a symbol of the city. It sits on a big hill overlooking a cliff on one side and fairly high up a steep, switchback path. I've read that the castle predates the city, which makes a lot of sense. You really can't approach it from the cliffside, as you'll see in the next photo, and between the steep climb, the sturdy walls, and what was, through most of its history when they kept anyone from the building in line of sight, as easily defensible as the main entrance. The route I picked up takes me past something called the Affenfelsen, which means ape rocks. You don't go there to see chimps. There aren't any monkeys at all. You go there for the views upward of the castle and then back downwards toward the city. Nuremberg Castle is one of the most famous and magnificent castles in Germany. Every Holy Roman Emperor between 1050 and 1571 lived here at least part-time. Essential administrative functions were carried out at the castle as well. Charles IV, we met him earlier as the Holy Roman Emperor, enacted the Golden Bull here at the castle in 1356. This decree required that newly elected German kings would hold their first General Assembly here in Nuremberg and was a real boost for the city. This is a view from the cliffside. You can see the sturdy walls and how tall it is. It would have been impossible for someone to climb it in the Middle Ages, and it was as easily defensible, if not more so, than the other side. It would have been a real bear for someone to take, even with modern weapons, as eventually proved to be the case in 1945. Although the castle was in its day among the strongest in Europe, stonework is really no match for long-term artillery bombardment. The castle was modified and modernized from time to time, but after the 7 Years' War was essentially abandoned. In the 19th century, with the advent of German Romanticism, it was tricked up again to look like something out of a fairy tale. When Hitler came to power, he found the modern trappings to be repulsive and had it restored to what he and his architects imagined was its golden age, in preparation for the coming Nazi party rallies in the area. As it had in earlier centuries, the castle was a focal point for the defense of the city, this time by the Nazis. Here's a bit of what World History Net has to say about it. A few days later, during World War II and its air raids in 1944 and 45, a large part of the castle was laid in ruins. It took a while and plenty of blood and munitions, but eventually, on Hitler's birthday, the defenders gave up. It took some 30 years to complete the rebuilding and restoration to its present state. Nuremberg is often referred to as having been the unofficial capital of the Holy Roman Empire because the imperial diets and courts met here at the castle. The diets of Nuremberg were an important part of the administrative structure of the empire. What you see here is part of the interior of the castle. Those two buildings in the center house the deep well. You can go on a tour of the well if you're interested. It's some 160 feet dug into the sandstone. Castles, when well-provisioned, staffed, and if they had adequate water supplies, could hold out for an incredibly long time against even the most determined besiegers. Although this well is quite deep by my standards, and the water inside is generally about 10 feet or so. It really wasn't enough except for ordinary use. When the Holy Roman Emperor and his inevitable and inescapable coterie of cronies and hangers-on came to town, the castle had to haul water up from the river in barrels. It must have been a back-breaking job. The historic art bunkers are a series of cellars buried inside the rock under Castle Hill. Toward the end of World War II, it became apparent that Nuremberg, no matter how exalted its status in the Reich, was viewed quite differently by the Allies. As the war continued, the Luftwaffe became increasingly unable even to protect Berlin, much less cities further afield. Other cities sent their artwork far away, but Nuremberg sheltered everything they cared about and could move right here. I mentioned earlier that the castle sits on sandstone. Underneath and nearby is an extensive complex of cellars which date back to the 1500s. According to the city website, these aren't natural caves. They were cut out by hand. Because of their consistent cool temperature, these cellars, going down about 4 stories, were ideal for making and storing beer. The extensive system of vaults and galleries was ventilated by an ingeniously simple trick. They just stuck air shafts in. A fanatical Nazi politician named Karl Holz was in charge of the city defenses. He ordered that anyone attempting to flee, refusing to work, or trying to surrender should be executed. Holz planned to enforce Hitler's so-called Nero Decree, which told Germans to self-destruct not just all the art and infrastructure, but themselves, rather than to surrender. He was willing to blow up entire sections of the city, including the arts bunker. Holz's plan was apparently the last straw for the city mayor, a man named Willy Liebel, who was an associate of Hitler's pet architect, Albert Speer. The mayor apparently didn't much like anyone who did all the Aryan purity tests and was more than willing to deport Jewish people to Dachau, but he did apparently appreciate art and architecture. Who knows, maybe he was thinking about how the city in his charge would survive this mess at all. When the American troops entered the eastern outskirts of the city, Liebel hid in a shelter below the police department headquarters and tried to negotiate a surrender. Holtz, implementing the die to the last man decree, broke into the room and shot the mayor in his head, later claiming that the mayor had committed suicide. Ultimately, Holtz was killed in a standoff with American soldiers after refusing 4 chances to surrender not just himself but the city. The Americans took the city, moved into the castle, and discovered the doors to the bunker. At this point, no one knew what this was. One of the U.S. Army Monuments men, I have a blog post about them, and I'll put a link in the description box below. A German who had attended Heidelberg University and later fled to America came in and started asking questions. Eventually, he and his comrades forced the truth out of the surviving city officials. All the art and cultural items were eventually returned to where they had been before the war. Many of them were even resituated back into churches here in Nuremberg. The Amber Room, however, has never resurfaced. Albrecht Dürer was one of the most famous residents in Nuremberg. He lived here in this house for the last 20 years of his life. Dürer was a contemporary of Michelangelo. He studied in Venice and is credited with bringing the Renaissance to Germany. Here, courtesy of the City of Nuremberg Museum's website, are 3 views of the house. On the left, in the late 19th century, in the middle, about 1947, and on the right, today. The massive air raid on Nuremberg's Old Town in January of 1945 did not completely spare this house. Bombs landing nearby blew part of the roof off and knocked out the windows and sections of the exterior walls, but the building never caught fire and it never collapsed completely. Its core was still standing when the war ended, and as early as 1949, the major damage caused by World War II had been repaired. Today it is a museum. Dürer's house is the only artist's house in Northern Europe that still survives in largely the original form from the Renaissance. Quite close to the Dürer house is one of the oddest sculptures I've ever seen, called The Rabbit. I read that it's meant to be a satire or possibly some kind of kinky homage to Albrecht Dürer, whose still-life rabbit I've reproduced in the inset. Most people aren't charmed by it and call it the world's ugliest sculpture. I wouldn't go that far, but I have to admit it is weird. The sculpture shows a bug-eyed rabbit that fell over so hard it broke a wooden box. You can see how big this thing is by the people standing in the background. A positive horde of demonic-looking rabbits are escaping from the box. Under the rabbit's neck, and worse, is a human foot. The human did not escape. In front, there's a comparatively tiny casting that I believe is supposed to represent a normal rabbit. Although there's plenty more to see, we'll end today's walking tour so that we can head downhill and back toward the river. I think we deserve a reward and have to admit I'm actually quite partial to rabbit, although that last rabbit did put me off the beast, at least for today. Today's delicious delight is Franconian-style sauerbraten, shown here in my dining room and served with red cabbage, peas, potatoes, and wine. I put the recipe for this on my regular blog post. I will put a link in the description box below. You might imagine that sauerbraten is sauerbraten and ask yourself, why red wine? How wrong you are. It turns out that this is Franconian sauerbraten. It has plenty of similarities to all the others, including the requirement to marinate it for at least 5 days, but is prepared with no sweetener either in the marinade or in the cooking liquid. The sauce is thickened and slightly sweetened with crumbled ginger snaps. I know that sounds unusual, but the ginger snaps do really make a very nice gravy. Thank you for joining me today to visit some of the fascinating sites on offer here in Nuremberg and for supper. Come back next week and we'll venture outside of the city proper for a day trip here on The Armchair Traveler.